I live in North America without a car. How? Well, transit, of course. I remember telling someone from Europe that I lived without a car, and they were shocked. They seemed to assume that my life would be totally miserable here if I didn't own one. Now, a lot of transit and urban planning talk rightly flames North America for being way too car-centric. But there are plenty of people, myself included, who live pretty happily without a car and prefer it that way. So I decided to make a video about how and why I live without a car, and why it's nice even in North America. Let's dive in. For more on cities, transit, and more, make sure you're subscribed down below and hit the bell icon so you actually get notified when I release a new video. I should preface everything I talk about in this video by saying yes, I do live in Toronto, which is not only one of the larger but more transit-oriented cities in North America. A lot of the stuff I'll talk about isn't necessarily possible everywhere, but it's also not impossible everywhere. Most North American cities have old portions of the urban fabric, usually closer to the city center, that are dense and fairly walkable. That's especially true of cities like Toronto, as well as Vancouver, and other cities across the continent that push back against the expansion of highways in the 20th century. Now, the inevitable thing that comes up, at least in Canada, whenever you talk about living in the city center is, wow, isn't that expensive? And to be fair, in Canada, living downtown often is more expensive than living in the suburbs. But it's worth remembering that cars are also a pseudo-necessity when you're living in the suburbs, something that's definitely not true in the dense, walkable, older parts of a lot of cities. And so I think it's impossible to recognize that living in the suburbs often has a much higher real cost than living in a dense, walkable area. Now, I think we should start this discussion about living in North America car-free where many of my days start, at a cafe. Unlike where I grew up in the suburbs, I don't need to drive or bike for an hour to get to the nearest cafe, and there's actually options besides just the local Starbucks. Now, the neighborhood I live in definitely isn't Hong Kong or even Amsterdam dense, but I can walk to most of the things I regularly need to in like 10 or 15 minutes. Now, another food-related issue that I hear a lot about when it comes to living car-free in North America is groceries. How are you supposed to get them if you don't have a giant car to load them into? But as it turns out, there are a lot of options for people to get food if they don't have a car. Because yes, indeed, people who don't have cars also need to eat. Being more seriously, there are a ton of options, especially since the pandemic. One option I see a lot of people using is little wheeled carts, which allow them to carry more than they could comfortably carry in their hands and walk along through their neighborhood back to their home. For me, I usually just use a backpack. I carry one with me most of the places I go anyways, so I can have my phone, camera, and notepad with me. That said, more and more grocery stores also provide delivery services, so that's an option as well and means you can potentially get a lot more groceries at once. Of course, if you run out of things, you don't even necessarily need to go to the grocery store, which might be further away sometimes. There are a lot of convenience stores, which I would say are different from the typical thing you see at a gas station. A lot of neighborhood convenience stores in the old, dense city centers of North America have little, small grocery sections where you can get things like milk or maybe some fresh vegetables. That said, when I decided where I was living in my city, I did consider where's the grocery store, because it is one of the trips you make the most often, so living nearby is super convenient. Now, my family in Toronto unfortunately mostly doesn't live car-free. But to be honest, that's mostly okay. I can get to suburban areas of the city really easily on the high-frequency suburban bus grid, along with using the subway and train systems, which living downtown these days I frankly look for any excuse to use. That said, even if I can't get further afield easily, family is usually willing to meet me halfway, and in the worst case scenario, I can get a ride share or something like that. Of course, day-to-day life without a car is also awesome. I can go to a movie or to the mall if I really want, and I don't have to deal with parking in a giant parking lot or parking garage. But unlike in the suburbs, that's not the only thing you can do for recreation. Just walking through older neighborhoods is a lot of fun, and there are a lot of interesting parks and other things that you just stumble upon. That said, unlike the suburbs, there tends to be a lot more actually happening, whether it be community events or live music, or shutting the whole city down for art exhibits overnight, like we do in Toronto every year. I should quickly mention, back on the topic of malls, that getting to malls in the Greater Toronto area and other places in Canada, as well as some other places in North America, is actually really easy on transit. Most of the major malls are actually connected to the subway system, and a few more of them will be getting rail links in the next couple of years. Malls are often also where bus hubs tend to be, so you can get to malls and other shopping sites really easily on transit. Of course, I talk a ton about transit on my channel, but it's hardly the only way to get around my city. There's also a growing network of bikeways and bike lanes as well as bike priority streets throughout the city. And I have to say there's a sort of satisfying element to bike infrastructure that might be worth getting into in a future video, in that you can just roll it out really quickly. Over the period of the pandemic, Toronto's bike network has actually ballooned in size, and that kind of thing just isn't really possible with rail transit in particular. Using all those bike lanes is actually not as hard as you might think either. Toronto has a great bike share system, and other cities in North America also have really good bike shares, like Montreal and New York City. Now, Not Just Bikes actually made a great video on it recently, but living in an urban area, you tend to get a lot of exercise just built into your daily routine. For me, between walking to the shop or the grocery store or my local train station, I can often end up walking several kilometers in the span of a day. And if I want to properly work out, I can also go to a ton of different gyms and activities, because the dense nature of the downtown area of a city means there tends to be a lot more options, and the hours are often a lot more forgiving than out in the suburbs. Want to work out at 2 a.m.? Why not? Now, what if I need to go somewhere further than I can just walk on my feet? It might surprise you to know, but since I moved downtown, I do use transit less. In the suburbs, especially in Toronto, getting around without a car means riding transit basically to go anywhere. But for me here in a walkable area, I can walk to most of the things I want to do. And even more so than with transit, it's so easy when you're walking somewhere to hop into a shop or to stop and watch something, which is really nice. Of course, the nice thing is that cities have a lot of mobility options. You can ride a bike, you can ride transit, you can walk, you can take a scooter, or you can get a ride share. And there's a lot of other options too. Depending on how you're feeling on a particular day, the weather, or what traffic is like, there are many different options that could potentially get you to your destination faster or more comfortably. Now, I've talked about it in previous videos, but one of the things that sucked the most about living in the suburbs was when we went traveling. It meant a long and often really stressful drive to the airport, you don't want to miss your flight, where you would end up in a gigantic parking lot or parkade and you have to lug your heavy suitcases all the way into the airport terminal. The nice thing about living in a walkable, transit-oriented place is you can just walk with your suitcase over to the train station, get on the train, ride to the airport, and you have a nice weather-protected walk into the terminal to check your bags. And the fare for the airport train, at least in Toronto, and frankly in a lot of places, is cheaper than even like one day of parking at the airport. Of course, unlike in Vancouver, I actually don't even feel the need to fly for a lot of the trips I end up making, since so many can be made via rail. That's funny, via rail. Okay, and anyways, traveling by rail is obviously way more convenient than traveling by plane, even if your rail system is a little janky, though we are working on that. You can show up just before the train leaves, you have Wi-Fi and cell service for the whole ride, there's no arduous security check, it's just nice. But what if there isn't transit, or an easy train option? What if you want to go into the wilderness, or just to IKEA? Now this is something I actually surprisingly care a lot about. Vancouver, where I grew up, has a really strong outdoors culture, and going hiking or skiing was a big part of growing up for me. As it turns out though, the reality is that driving your car for a lot of the tasks that ostensibly require a car often really sucks. If I'm going to go on a long road trip where I might get a chipped windshield or put a ton of kilometers on a vehicle, I don't really want to do it in a vehicle I own, since that'll cause it to depreciate. So it would probably be better to just rent a car. And if you're going camping, especially in the backcountry, you probably don't want to be going down logging roads and the like in a nice city car. So again, renting probably makes more sense in a lot of cases. Of course, this is also super true if you're going to IKEA. It's way easier to just rent a van, whether it be from a car share company or from a traditional car rental company, than to try to stuff tables and bed frames into your car. And the best part is that once you're done with the van, you don't have to worry about it. I will say, car sharing is one place where Toronto really falls down, but Vancouver by comparison is a lot better on this. Not only are there a bunch of different car share providers in Vancouver and car share vehicles kind of all over the place, but there's a really cool car share company called Evo that actually has these Prius car share vehicles that have bike racks and stuff on them, so you can take them to go mountain biking or something like that, which is really nice. A final note on the whole car share and rental car thing, if you really need to, the nice thing about having an air rail link is that airports tend to be where a ton of rental car options are, and if you have an air rail link, you can get there easily on transit. Now, all of this isn't to say that life without a car here is perfect. It's not, but it also isn't in a lot of places around the world, including in places in Europe and Asia. But what I would say is that the things I notice most that make the city less pleasant for me would still exist even if I did own a car, which I made a whole video about previously, talking about why that's incredibly expensive and not fun. The first major thing for me is safety. Far too often, street designs are incredibly dangerous. And not just for pedestrians and cyclists, but for drivers as well. Though it is much more dangerous for pedestrians and cyclists because mass. Comfort is also often a problem. A lot of public spaces and public transit, particularly public transit vehicles, aren't as well maintained as they could be. Though I will say the cities I've lived in Canada have been better than average in my experience traveling in different places around the world. And so I'd say that's a bit of a broader problem. The last major issue I think exists is accessibility, and that sometimes means accessibility in the most basic form. People being able to access spaces, whether it be elevator access or sidewalks which are adequately wide, but also on the more macro scale. A lot of places aren't as accessible by transit as they probably should be, and in some cases that's being fixed. But the car-centric mentality of designing cities to sprawl out and literally take up more space means that a lot of things are just way farther apart than they really need to be. Now, as I said before, you can always get a car share, but actually not everyone can, and most people would rather not. Of course though, there are also a ton of positives. Driving is dangerous, unhealthy, and expensive. And as I tweeted about recently, go follow me on Twitter down below, there's a really special element to living in a dense city environment where you might just run into people you know. Of course, that can happen if you live in the suburbs and you're at, say, the mall, but it's so much less likely to happen when you're driving down a street in a sealed-off bubble at 60 kilometers per hour. Perhaps most of all though, the thing I love about living in a city is I get to vote with my feet for a city that's more equitable, more accessible, healthier, and better for the environment. Now, anytime I've made a video about owning a car or living car-free in the past, someone is always up in arms saying, well, I need to own a car for X reason or Y reason. And you know what? That's fine. If you have a legitimate reason to own a car, that's okay. Even Amsterdam has its highways. But what I want you to do is question whether you really need a car. And if a more comfortable, accessible, affordable, transit-oriented life isn't possible. Thanks for watching.